Welcome back to Yerushalmi Terumot. We're holding at the fourth parak, which is roughly Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis. Now we're talking about cases where you separated a portion of the Terumot or Maestros which were required. Excuse me for my cough today. So Hamafresh makes us Terumot or Maestros. You had a mound of 100 sar of tevel. You have to separate 2 sar for Truma, which is the normal 1 in 50. However, a person separated only 1 sar. So, Moitzi Mimenu Truma Olav. You've only separated 1 sar so far. You can continue now to separate the remaining part of the Truma, which is required. Now, out of what's left, some of that fruit has already been rectified with the first sar that you separated. So now, really, in this mixture, it's tevel and chulin mixed up. Some of it has been sorted and rectified, and some of it hasn't. So we're not worried that now I go ahead and separate another sar. We're not worried that maybe what I'm taking out now has chulin in it, and which I can't make it into truma. We say no. Whatever comes up in my hand is tevel. You get that? So the second sar that I put out will come out of the tevel section. However, we're happy to go as far to say out of this mixture I can separate truma from this mixture for this mixture. However, I'm not allowed to separate truma from this mixture for elsewhere, other tevel which I have. As far as other fruit is concerned, we are worried that when I pull out something, it will be chulin that comes out. You have rectified chulin that comes out of my hand. So we're happy for itself to separate another sar, but we're not happy to use it to separate for other produce elsewhere. Reb Meir says, you can even use it to separate for elsewhere, for truma and maestros. Okay. Now, the Rambam learns, we're not talking about this mixture, whether you can separate truma and maestros from it. We're talking about the fruit itself that are separated for truma. And it's the fruit that you've separated. Basically, has it got a shem truma or maser on it, or does it remain tevel? And the Mishnah says you have to separate truma and maser from it and not from elsewhere. This peiros was separated for truma and maser. It looks like truma or maser, and if you separate it now from tevel, other tevel, it looks like your mafresh with a chiv al abtur. All right. Let's carry on. A mafresh makes us truma or maestros. So someone who separates part of the truma or maestros obligations. Now we said if in the beginning you only did a share of truma which was needed, you can go. You only did part of it. You can continue to separate the remainder apart. Another sar, as we said. Now. Masnisin, our Mishnah is talking about a case, you separated, and your intention was to separate more. So you knew you did a bit less earlier on. Your intention was to finish the job. So the Mishnah says you can go and separate again from this mixture. We don't say the first hafrosha, everything was corrected, and there's tevel and chulin mixed together, and you can't separate more, because your intention was always to separate more, right? You only did 1 sar out of 100. You're always going to do 2, which is 1 in 50, which is the standard amount. It's as if you stipulated from the beginning. You don't want to exempt yourself with that first sar, right? Therefore, the fruit that come up in the second separation is tevel, and you can use it for taking truma. Now, if, however, when you separated the first time, you had no intention to continue, remember, according to Minat Torah, it could be 1 wheat kernel is enough to patter for truma. Yeah, you don't need a whole sar, right? So therefore, if you had the intention from the beginning not to separate anymore, and now you change your mind, then maybe you can't go back and separate more, because with the first separation you'd corrected some of the fruit, and now it's all a mixture of tevel and chulin, and what comes in your hand has got chulin coming out, and you can't use that to make it into truma. Rav Shimon Shem Rav Zeira, he said, he says, even if you didn't say that you want to separate more, you can separate more. Does Rav Zeira argue on the Gemara, he allows you to separate even if you didn't have the intention? He said, no. The usual system is, right, Rav Chubazir is not arguing, if you want to say, I don't intend to do more, but even, he says, stam, if you say nothing when you separated it the first time, we assume your intention is you want to separate more. Okay? And therefore, you can continue later on. Because usually, even though you said nothing, your intention was always to separate more. Now, we said Levishla, you can separate more for itself, but not for elsewhere. Now let's see, what's the reason for this, according to the first opinion? What's the difference between separating for itself or separating from elsewhere? So he says, when you separate for itself, we say, you know what, it's only tevel that comes in your hand. Whatever comes in your hand is tevel. You can use it to take trouble. But when you take for elsewhere, then, look, you never had intention for it. So we say, you ended up picking up tevel and chulin, which has been rectified, and you can't separate truma with that. Now, but it's difficult. Because notal, if you take fruit, to cover for itself, we say kala tevel alabiyad, it's only tevel that's come out. If you change your mind while it's in your hand, and now you want to take so it was all tevel in your hand, and then you change your mind and think, oh, I'll separate it for elsewhere, and not for this. Now suddenly we say, oh, wait a minute, it's not all tevel in your hand? Do you understand? This is the great magic trick, right? You pick up tevel because I want to separate for this. Now I change my mind for elsewhere. Oh, now I suddenly say it's not all tevel, it's a mixture of tevel and chulin. So how can that be? So suddenly you have a bit of everything. And the other way around. You took some to take for elsewhere. We say, well, you've got a mixture of tevel and chulin. But then I change my mind. I think, no, I'll only separate it for here. We say, now it's all tevel again? Wonderful question. We have no answer. Right? No answer. How suddenly you change your mind in the middle when it's in your hand, it suddenly changes status? How does that work? Now, we did say, if from the beginning you only separated some of it, and your intention was always to complete the separation later, then what you took from your kri, for your amount, is tevel, and is fitting to be truma, despite the fact that there's tevel and chulin mixed up. Now, what's the din if you never clearly said with the second time the amount? You didn't take out the exact amount that's required to make up the required truma. You took a bit less, a bit more. You understand? So you took 1 sar, and then you took, say, half a sar. So now what happens? Piches. So if in the second time you did less than the required amount, say there was 100 sar, you separated 1 sar at the beginning, you need to do another sar to make it 150, and instead you separated half a sar. So one thing's clear. Kol tevel alabiyada. Well, that's clearly what's in your hand is tevel now. Whatever you've taken out is tevel, like we did about Mishnah. But what about when the second separation is haisif? You added more onto the required amount. You separated 1.5 sar. Now what's the din? Now it could be the fruit that you added onto the share. We say mizeh or mizeh alabiyada. Maybe it's now tevel and chulin mixed up. And we can't say, well, you said from the beginning it should be tevel like the rest, because although you can increase in truma as much as you want, but maybe that's only when you separate it all in one go. But here you did the beginning part of it, and what was chal the second time is because you had an intention to continue. And it's as if you had intention from the beginning it should be tevel. Maybe for the normal share that you separate, we can say, oh, your intention was to separate it. But what you've separated more than the normal amount, you hear that? What you're going above and beyond, it's not logical to tell me that your intention was it from the beginning to separate. You never thought you were going to separate 2.5 sar. Therefore, it should be tevel and chulin mixed together. On the other hand, it could be that your intention in the beginning was whatever I'm going to separate. And even if you end up doing more, 2.5 sar, and therefore even the extra maybe comes from tevel. Maybe the whole thing is called tevel. You hear that? So do we say, look, you never expected to do 2.5, so that half is coming from a mixture of chulin and tevel? Or do we say, no, my intention was whatever I'm going to separate. And so now it ended up 2.5, it'll be 2.5. And it will all come from Tevel, which is where we want it to come from. And then the Gemara says, well, you got that question, but we got another question. What about where you made a mistake? You thought you have to separate 2 sar. You only have to separate 1. Are we going to tell me you made a mistake, you have to do too much? Whatever's extra is like you made a Tanai from the beginning, you should stay Tevel, and you can make it Truma on elsewhere. Or since you're not obligated in it, is Tevel and Chulin mixed together? So at least the answer for the recent question, Rabbi Imi Shem Ben Lakish, I saw that extra sar shul mafresh where you made a mistake and separated it. I saw Truma Makamacha. You can make it Truma for elsewhere. Since you thought from the beginning you have to separate another 2 sar, your intention was on both they should be Tevel. Now it comes out as a mistake, it stays Tevel. You can make it Truma for elsewhere. Now, V'hatadina, but we've learned in our Mishnah, if you separate some of the Truma and Maestras, you can be mafresh the extra sar. Avalai, you cannot separate even that sar for elsewhere. We said you can't separate it for elsewhere, only for here. Yeah, avalai amache. Only for this tikkun of this kri, it's like you made a condition for that sar, it should be everything's tevel. But not if we're separating it for other fruit. So if on the sar you're mechuyev, we say that, how much more so the sar where you made a mistake, where you're not obligated at all, you can't make it truma for elsewhere. You never made that condition only for the sake of this mound and not like Rish Lakish. So surely it shouldn't help for you to separate truma for elsewhere, right? You never had the condition that it should be for elsewhere. If it doesn't work for here, you made a mistake, it shouldn't work for elsewhere. So the Gemara says, you know what? Tifta, we can talk about our case of the Mishnah, b'ma b'truma. So from the beginning, you separated the amount that was required, and you had the intention to do more than what's needed. So in this situation, the Mishnah says that extra bit, you can separate it as a Tosefes for Truma, for itself, but not for elsewhere. You hear that? You wanted to do a bit more, fair enough. It's good enough for this mound, but not for elsewhere. If from the beginning, you separated part of it, and your intention is to make up my obligation, then what's considered, what is in your mind to separate as Tevel, but whether for itself or for elsewhere, basically it's considered you're separating like Tevel for everything. 1 second. Yeah, if from the beginning you only separated part of it and your intention is to do more, then what your intention was is considered as Tevel, whether for here or for elsewhere. And the same thing that the mistake that you thought you were obligated, and basically he wants to say it's like Rish Lakish. So he wants to say it does help. Yeah, if that was your intention, you thought you were obligating yourself, you thought you were obligated, we can consider it as Tevel. Okay? And therefore it can be Tevel, it can be for here, for elsewhere, for everywhere. Then the Gemara says, Nicha, I understand, but ma b'truma. You can increase in truma as much as you want, but maestros, what are you going to tell me for maestros? The Mishnah mentioned truma and maestros. Now you can't separate too much maestros. Why? Because maestros, you're not allowed to separate more than a tenth. Not allowed to separate more than a tenth, right?
But we're talking in a case where he thought he had to take 2 sar.
Well, he doesn't know how much he has. Well, we're not talking about mistake. You intentionally, you intend. The wording of the Mishnah is you're doing extra. We say truma, I understand you can do extra, and we talk about you had intention, you didn't have intention. But maestros, you can't do extra. Maestros, what are you going to tell me? You can't be marba by maestros. You can't separate more than a tenth. Because Laitani of Shem Ben Lakish, maestros was mentioned in our Mishnah. So we can't use this idea of, you were doing more truma, because on maestros is also mentioned. You can't tell I was doing more maestr. So you have to say, we're not talking about where you're giving more than what's required. No. Your intention was to make up the amount that was required, and the question comes back on Rish Lakish from our Mishnah, right? The question comes back on him. So the Gemara says, we can explain the Mishnah according to Rish Lakish slightly differently. Now, why does Rish Lakish didn't want to learn the Mishnah the way we learned it, right? Rish Lakish was the one who said, when you made a sar by mistake, you can make it truma on elsewhere. That's what Rish Lakish answered, right? When you separated that sar, you were mistaken. You made a mistake on the amount, and since you thought you have to do 2 sar, therefore both can be tevel. Even though now it works out it was a mistake, it remains tevel. You can make it truma for elsewhere. So the Gemara wanted to explain, we said one shot in Rosh Lakish, but then how does that work with Maestros? You're doing too much. How does it work with Maestros? So we try again. Ella, Talmud Rosh Lakish. The reason for Rosh Lakish is as follows. Mekimin du Omar, because the Tana of our Mishnah says that with the second separation, Kala Tevel Alabiyada, wherever it comes in his hand is Tevel. Now, Mabin Moitzi Menu Alav, Mabin Moitzi Menu Makamach. What difference is it if I'm separating for here or elsewhere? If it's Tevel, who cares if I'm separating for here or elsewhere? And that's the Gemara asked that earlier on. What is the difference? And that's why Rosh Lakish said that our Mishnah wasn't talking about every case. It's talking about a specific case. Okay? He's not accepting the difference between here and elsewhere, because there's no difference. If we take out that whatever's in your hand is Tevel for everything. There wasn't even separating it for here, for separating for elsewhere. Yeah? So because of that, he didn't want to say every situation. So Maikadun. So how are we going to explain the Mishnah? He says it's talking about a case. You know what? The majority, your first separation covered the majority of what's needed. There's only a minority left, which is Tevel. You hear that? Within Torah, the Tevel that is left is Batel in the majority Chulin. Okay? And the whole Kri is considered rectified because you did the majority. And Medin Torah, Truma is Batel Barayim. The whole thing is Batel. Midrabanan, it's not Batel. And we need to correct what's left. So the Mishnah said, you can separate from the fruit for itself, but you can't separate for other areas, which is Tevel and Torah. But in a situation where you never separated the majority the first time round, and some of the fruit is proper Tevel min Torah, then you can separate whether for the Kri itself here or for other fruits of Tevel. So he's saying the difference is, what did you separate first time round? If you separated the majority, then min Torah everything's batel and everything's covered. And now you want to separate again, you can't separate for elsewhere. Because elsewhere is Tevel min Torah and this is covered min Torah. However, right, if you didn't separate the majority, you didn't cover the majority, then you can separate whether for here or for elsewhere. Now this question whether Tevel is batel b'roiv min Torah or not is machlokes b'roiv, and Rosh Lakish follows his view that Tevel is batel b'roiv. And he says Pelota the Chizkiya Rabbi Yochanan. It's an argument of Chizkiya Rabbi Yochanan. The Amish Lakish Chizkiya. He says the Torah din is Tevel batel b'roiv. That Tevel is batel b'roiv chulin, and Rabbi Yochanan he says ain't Tevel batel b'roiv. He says not batel min Torah. The Kivan Shanasal Dat in the Hafresh. This time I'll call Chita v'Chita b'Mkoma. Since you had the intention that you want wherever you want to separate, why the Tevel is not batel b'roiv? Because you want to do more. So since you put your mind to separate, so each wheat stays in its place, as it were. B'Mkoma. You don't have a mixture. You can be Maser the Tevel, which is mixed. It's like you can be Mavara the Isur. So there's no din bittul. In other words, bittul is when you've got nothing you can do about it. But here we can still separate more, right? And that's why there's no din bittul. Okay? So therefore each wheat is in its own place. There's no mixture. I can still separate whatever Tevel here is mixed up. And that's why Kunjab Yochanan, we can't explain the Mishnah the way Rosh Lakish explained it, where you've done the majority, but he understood it according to the earlier understanding we have. So he says here, according to Yochanan, if you made a mistake and separated for the second time more than what's required, you can't make it truma on elsewhere. Okay? Right. Now, according to our Maskana now, to explain Rosh Lakish, there's a difference between if you corrected the majority, because if you corrected the majority, you can separate for it, but not for elsewhere, as we said in our Mishnah. If you corrected the minority, you can separate even on elsewhere. Yeah, if you only corrected the minority, then this is proper Tevel min Torah. So you can separate it for elsewhere. The Gemara brings those who wanted to say there's a difference between if you corrected majority of it, so if you corrected the minority in a slightly different way. So there is to by Meima Kardadatani. Some want to say this difference with that which we've learned from Lezv and Yaakov in a Brisa. The Tanya of Lezv and Yaakov, he said, if you separate some of Truma or Maisris, right? You separate some of it. Eina Moitzi, you can't separate more Truma Lo alav, lo mokem acher, not for it and not for elsewhere. So this Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, he argues on the Tan of our Mishnah. He holds you cannot separate Maestros at all, even on itself. Even on itself, you did a bit, that's it. You can't separate anymore. Not on it, not on elsewhere. Right? Because the whole Kriya is a mixture of Tevel and Chulin. And whatever you get second time round, maybe it's Chulin. So he says, once it's second time round, you can't separate anything. So if someone had a question, maybe Ad Kadum, maybe Rebbe ben Yaakov said his din, that you cannot separate more than Maestros, right, even on itself. But maybe maybe when the majority is not yet corrected with the first time round. But in the case of Niskan Ruba Shokri, if you had separated the majority first time round, and now the Chiv Afrosha is only rabbinical, perhaps Rebbe ben Yaakov will agree to the Tanakama that you can at least separate for itself. You hear that? If you've covered the Torah din, you've separated the majority, maybe Rebbe ben Yaakov will agree you can separate for here, for what's left. Huh? Okay, but there's only a Chiv Drabanan, so you'll separate with a Drabanan for Drabanan. Maybe not for elsewhere, but at least for itself. The Yeval Kada, and we can actually work out the answer from the following situation. Hayel Lefanav, the Gemara actually brings a proof to push away this far. Yeval Kada, we could answer from the following case. Hayel Lefanav Shnei Krain, you had two mounds. Echad Hifrish Mimenu Mixas Truma. One you separated a bit of Truma and Maaseh, and the other one you separated a bit of Truma and Maaseh. Two mounds. Can you separate from one mount for the other? Because they're both the same. The Talmud of the Great, they asked him, and he says, the foolish man embraces his arms, he eats his flesh. If he's foolish, if you separate part of the Truma, part of the Maaseh, and then you stop separating everything, you can't correct what's left. Whether for one for the second one, or each one on itself, you basically end up with nothing to eat. You'll eat your flesh, basically. So Rav Chia is answering to them, not only one Kri you can't separate from the other one, but even to separate from each one for itself you can't do. Because he holds like Rebbe ben Yaakov, who forbids you to separate even for itself. Now, Rav Chia made no chiluk, no difference whether the majority of the Kri was sorted or maybe the miut of the Kri was sorted. So we see that even if the majority is sorted, you cannot separate anymore, even for itself, according to Rebbe ben Yaakov.
So it wouldn't be also
Once you, huh?
It would be also Duraban.
It'll be also, you cannot separate, you'll have to find elsewhere to separate from it. You'll have to cover it from elsewhere. You can't separate it from here. Okay? Rabbi Lazar B'Shem Rav Chia Rabbah, he says, Ein Tomim Lo Ma'asrim Mizal Zeh. You can't take. His answer, this is explaining the answer of Rav Chia slightly differently. Ein Tomim Lo Ma'asrim Mizal Zeh. You cannot separate one mount from the second one, but you can separate each one for itself, according to Rabbi Lazar. And Rav Chia holds like the Tanakama, according to this view, like in our Mishnah, you can separate for itself. But he said, you can't separate Truma one for the other, and since that's the case, we can't learn from his words about what about the view of Rebbe ben Yaakov. Basically, this is another view. This is like the Mishnah. This is like the Tanakh in our Mishnah. This is not like Rebbe ben Yaakov at all. Okay? Could be Rebbe ben Yaakov says you can't even separate for itself. But this view, Rebbe Lazar learns you can't separate one for the other, but you can separate for itself. Okay? And Rebbe is like the Tanakh in our Mishnah. You can definitely separate for itself. You just can't separate for elsewhere. Okay, so according to Rebbe Lazar, Rav Chia holds like the Tanakh in our Mishnah, that allows you to separate for itself, but you cannot separate from one Kriya for the other one, despite the fact they both have the same din. Okay? Okay. So many, right, okay. Yeah, let's carry on. So, you have your fruit in the storehouse. You want to take some to eat. But Nasan saw Leben Levi. You ended up giving one saw to a Levi as Maaseh, the saw La'ani, and another saw to the poor man, Maaseh Ani, to allow you to have the fruit. So you separated Maaseh and Maaseh Ani. Mafresh Aid Shmaina Sa'id Va'echla. you're allowed to eat, relying on that, another 8 sah, which is the fruit that's permitted through the Maisa. You don't have to check if the Maisras that you've separated are still in existence in the Levi's hand. Or the Oni. You don't have to say, does the Oni still have the Maisa that I gave him? You can separate another 8, relying on the fact that he still has the Maisa that you gave him. Okay? So here, the Maisra Sachal from the first time. So basically, I've given the Levi, I've given the Masa Oni, and relying on that, I can have another 8. Divrei Rameir. That is the view of Rameir. Now, despite the fact that at the time when you took Maisa, we didn't know which of the fruits will be rectified through that Maisa. You hear that? You have a big storehouse. Which is the 8th sah that's covered by the Maisa? We haven't clearly discerned it. We haven't decided what is the 8th sah going to be. But we say, right, based on the 1 sah that you gave to the Levi and the 1 sah of Trumas of the Masa Oni, you now have 8 that you can take out. And based on that, the Masa will be Chal. And this is Din of Breira. Right? When you take afterwards the 8th sah, it comes out the Mafreya that these were the fruits that had the Maisa taken on it. The Chachamim said, no, you can only separate to eat based on the amount of fruit that you know are still in existence in the Levi's hand or the poor man's hand when you want to start eating. For example, if let's say they have a half a sah, you're allowed to eat 4 sah. And if you don't have anything left, you can't eat anything. Because the Maisras, according to the Chachamim, are not Chal only when you're Mevareh, which fruit are the ones having Maisa taken, not beforehand. They don't hold a Breira, Rabbi said. They don't say what you take now is what was covered earlier on. They don't hold that. So that's the din of Breira here. According to the Chachamim, he says here, the Maisras were not Chal from the beginning, because it wasn't clear at that time what fruit is going to be going on. Right? Therefore, it's forbidden to eat from Megura unless you definitely have the 2 sah that you separated for the Levi and the Ani are still in existence when you're taking the remaining 8. And then the Maisa can be Chal. Right? So therefore, you have to be Mevareh before you take the Megura to eat various fruit. You know, are they still in the Levi's hand? Are they still in the Ani's hand? And for that, you're allowed to take accordingly. Okay? So they're working a din of Breira. Okay? Do you have to worry whether the Maisras are not Chal at that time or not? Some learn doesn't fit in with Yerushalmi later on. Some say everyone holds the Masa is Chal Mishum Breira. The argument is about the Chalos and Mafreya. Is the Masa Chal from the beginning, and then afterwards it comes out of Mafreya, so it doesn't have to be there at that time? Or maybe it's not Chal until it's Mavura and then it's Chal and Mafreya. So maybe it has to be there at that time. So the question is, at what point does it have to be there? Is it Chal from the beginning backwards or later on backwards? That's the question. All right. Okay. Where are we now? Yeah. Okay. So we said in our Mishnah that when you separated from Megura, a Sah and Maaseh, and you didn't say which fruit should the Maaseh be Chal, so the Maaseh is Chal on the first Sah that I'm going to eat. According to Rameir and Mafreya, according to Chachamim, Kan Labo. Now why don't we say the Maaseh is Chal on the Megura, and there'll be Tevel and Chulin all mixed together, like we said in the earlier Mishnah. So we're saying now the first 8 is what you can eat as Chulin. We don't say it's 8 is mixed up of Chulin and Tevel. We don't say that. So why not? So also I said we treated, when you make some of your fruit in the Megura, we treat it like the worker that doesn't trust the balabais. He wants to take the Maisa for the fruit that he's going to eat from the balabais. He doesn't trust the balabais. Well, we've learned in Dubai, the Chachamim were lenient to let him take Maasa first from some of the fruit of the balabais, which are in the Megura, and eat a certain amount, even though he's not yet choosing the fruit which is taking Maisa for, because he can't start taking Maisa every time he wants to eat. Right? He can't start taking Maisa left, right, and center. So he basically he's taking some now to cover him for the amounts that he'll be taking. So the same thing here. The Chachamim were lenient on the Balabais, and they allowed him to take Maisa on some of the Megura in order to eat, and the Masa will be Chal on the fruit. Wherever fruit he takes away, that's what the Masa will be Chal on. Now, according to Rameir in our Mishnah, he can be Mamara and eat from the Megura, Eitzah, even if they are not around now at the hands of the Levi anymore. Now, what's Rameir's view? Let's explain Rameir's view. Pshita Adam Milza, it's all very well, it's clear in Rameir's view. Nisrafu, if let's say, so I separate the Masa for the Levi, and then it gets burnt. Now, Peres, Nisrafu, they got lost before the Balabais managed to take my Eitzah. HaTruma B'Tela, the Truma is void, even Kudra Rameir. And whatever fruit you gave the Levi is Tevel. The separating of Maestros was what you're going to eat later. And since you never ate anything because it all got lost, it all got burnt, so the Maestros were not Chal. So you gave him Maestros, but there was nothing to take against it, so he didn't get Chal. However, Nisrafa, if it got burnt, or Truma, let's say, or with the Truma, with the Levi, or the Ani, if it got burnt, before you managed to eat the Eitzah, so what cases we got here? Nisraf, we said, so let's go back a bit. Nisrafu HaPeras, if the fruit, the Eitzah, got burnt, before I managed to take the Eitzah, then the Truma B'Tela, so even Kunjameh, whatever I gave is Tevel. Basically, the Hafrosha was only going to be what's going to be eaten, and since there's nothing to be eaten, there's no Hafrosha. Nisrafu HaTruma, if the Levi stuff got burnt, yeah, before I managed to eat my Eitzah, if the Levi stuff or the Oni stuff got burnt, Lekeshe Achlu HaPeras, Contra HaTruma LeMafreya. Now, it's not around now, but the beer is the Mafreya according to Rameir, so the Masa will be Chal when I end up eating the fruit. Right? From that time, that's when the Masa will take place, even though it's no longer in existence.
Wasn't the Mishnah talking about where he took just two and he
separated two?
But it wasn't the full amount for what he had.
It covers you for 8.
But he had a bigger amount, so why not just take a different 8 from the main?
Why don't you take what?
We said he had like 100, and he gave 2 to the.
So basically, we're just covering you for 8.
So, but he had like a bigger vat.
Yeah, so we're not looking at the rest. We're saying those 2 cover you for this 8. So now on this 8,
those 8 burnt.
Right, now these 2 got burnt. So then when you end up eating your 8, contra truma freya, that too becomes maser. The mafreya. Since the bira is a mafreya called Rameir, the maser is chal b'tchila, and the fruit is corrected at that time. Let's see what he says here. Some want to learn the maser is chal mafreya when you eat the fruit, and since the maser is not around at that time, you can't be mekadosh. You can't become holy the mafreya. There's different gisais here. Alright. So what we're saying, so it's chal mafreya. And therefore, when you end up eating the 8, that's when it's Chal Mafreya. Okay. Now, 3 levels in the share of separating Truma. Share Truma, Ein Yafet, person who's generous, Echad Ma'abayim, 1 in 40. Beishama Yom Rimechem, Shloshim, Beishama say 1 in 30. Ha'Beinonis, the medium person, Mechamishim, 1 in 50. Ra'ah, and the miser is Meshishim, 1 in 60. Now, what about if you always separate 1 in 40 and 1 in 50, you made a mistake, you gave a bit less. You ended up with 1 in 60. Truma, it is valid Truma. You don't separate anymore. At the end of the day, you did the right shit. And if, nevertheless, if you ended up doing more, you have to separate maestros on it, because it's not Shem Truma on that Tosefes. It was already part of all the fruit with your first separation. So it's Tevel as far as maestros is concerned. Like other fruit in the basket. Okay, so it remains Tevel as far as maestros is concerned. If you took Truma and you didn't do 1 in 60, you did 1 in 61, which is too few. Really, you should have separated more. It's Truma, but you should carry on and take Truma what you're used to. 1 in 40, 1 in 50, 1 in 60. Because your intention definitely was to do a share that Chachamim set aside. And that extra, that minimum amount that you did, 1 in 61, this. So you've got to cover yourself. You've got to make up the difference, and you don't have to do it with an estimation. But if you want to make up exactly how much you're missing, you can do it b'midah, either by looking at the volume, b'mishkal with weight, and median, or with number. Rabbi Yehuda said, there's another leniency. You can take truma shalei min hamukav. This separate second truma, not like normal truma where you have to be near there at the time, but it's according to the opinion that no, you don't need to be near it at the time, right? According to Rabbi Yehuda. Now, according to the Tanna Kama, there's no difference between other truma. You have to be near it, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, you don't have to be near it. Okay. Now, when we're talking about say 1 in 61, one chita is enough for the whole mound. But that's where that was your intention. But here, your intention was to do like the Chachamim, and you didn't succeed. You ended up 1 in 61, right? So therefore, you can do a bit more. It's like the beginning of a separating, and you have to separate more. Okay. Right. Siv, it says in the pasuk in Yecheskel. Now we're talking about where do these shiurim come from? 40, 50, 60. What remnants do we have in the psukim for them? Siv, it says. This is a truma you should separate. Shishis ha'efa b'chayma hachitim, 6th of an ephah of the wheat. V'shishisem ha'efa b'chayma sa'irim. Shishisem is like 2/6. Shishisem is talking about 2/6. Okay, the Pashab Shat means you divide the ephah into 6/6, and 1/6 you should separate for the barley. But it was actually the lashon here to become 2/6. Now an ephah is 3 sah. A chaymer is a core, so you have 30 sah, which is 10 ephah. So 1/6 of an ephah is half a sah, which is 1/60th of a chaymer. Shishisem is a sah, which is 1/30th of a chaymer. So let's see. Shishisem ephah b'chaymer achitim. Shishisem is ephah b'chaymer sa'irim. So we're learning that the word shishisem can mean 2/6. So we're telling you about 2 different shiurim. You've got shishis ha'ephah b'chaymer achitim, which is maybe 1/60th, and shishisem is 2/6 of an ephah, which is 1/30th of a chaymer. So we're telling you there's a difference between wheat and barley as to how much truma you have to separate. So one says, well, yachal, maybe I'll think Torah b'chitim echad. Maybe wheat is 1 in 60. Barley is 1 in 30. No. Talmud Loma, it says v'chol trumas kol. All everything. Shu kol trumas shabbos. All the truma of everything should be equal in their share. So what does it mean the pasuk when it mentions 6th of an ephah of chaymer achitin, v'shishisem ha'ephah b'chaymer sa'irim? The word learns we're telling you about the share of truma which is for a generous person. Shmuel Amar 10 shishis al shishisem. So give a bit more. Add the share of a 6th mentioned at the beginning of the pasuk with the 2/6 mentioned later on. So it becomes 3/6, which is half an ephah. And that's a share truma for 2 chamarim mentioned in the pasuk. But in so it comes out, you end up with 1 in 40, which is half an ephah, which is 1/40th of 2 chamarim. And from this, the Chachamim instituted that a generous person always gives 1 in 40. Okay? Now, Beinanis, an ordinary person, 1 in 50. Where do we get this from? Amram Levi, it says in the dividing of the spoils of Midian, of Machzis b'nei Sotigach Achad Achos, you should take 1 in 50. Achos b'nei Chamishim, that was the taxes they had to give. Ata Eiches b'makom Acha. So, Kol, wherever you're holding elsewhere, whenever you're separating the Truma, Avreu Kazet should be like this shit. Mazeh Achad b'Chamishim, this is 1 in 50. Avzev Shat Eiches b'makom Acha, Avreu Kazet is similar, it should be 1 in 50. V'ara Achad b'Shishim, the bad, the miserly is 1 in 60. The Chsiv, it says, Shishis ha'ephah ve'chaymer hachitim.
It's the same pasuk we had previously.
It is the pasuk we learned. We're dashing slightly differently. Until now, we learned the share of 1 in 40, but the mashmos, the normal share of the pasuk, is another share for truma, which is a 60th, because the 6th of an ephah is 1/60th of a chaymer. So forget about adding 1 and 2 and all that. Don't forget that. It's 1/6 of an ephah for 1 chaymer, which is 1 in 60. Okay, to be continued, Rabbi Sai.